didn't have volunteers for Culture Share, but it's the last time we met was kind of before COVID-19 really got crazy, and we were just kind of hoping that we could do a quick roll call and have everyone just say one word on how you're feeling, or one sentence on how you're feeling, or and just see who's also in the video chat. Rodrigo, do you want to start?
Sure. So I'm glad to be talking to y'all again. Miss y'all. Yeah, it's been a crazy couple weeks. I've gone from existential dread to this is gonna be okay. So I'm just worried about my family and my loved ones, and not so much myself, but I've been isolating, and I hope we'll make it through in a good place. But I know a lot of people are struggling out there, so if anyone wants to talk, I'm always open.
Thanks, Rodrigo. Mayuri, do you want to go next?
Sure. I'm feeling apprehensive about school, just like I think every other student. But the good news is I'm not worried about myself. So, yeah, and I'm at home in Dallas, so you probably won't see me in person for a while.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. How about Phoebe? Do you want to go next?
Sure. Well, I've gone through a series of emotions. I'm trying to balance how much media I consume, because I tend to be a, keeping up with everything type of person. Yeah, I mean, I've been stressed about my family. I was supposed to go home and visit the week pretty much before we kind of were told to stay home. And my brother is a high school senior, so his graduation stuff is up in the air. So that's kind of stressful, but otherwise hanging in here, and I'm really thankful for everybody's flexibility and willingness to switch into this virtual mode. So thank you, everybody.
And just if y'all are not talking, if you wouldn't mind muting, that would be cool. Thanks. Zach, how about you?
Yeah, I'm grateful that everybody is here today, and we're having such great participation in this call. And I'm excited for everybody to see these presentations and really hear like where this whole effort is right now. I think it's going to give everybody hope that we're gonna get there with the climate plan, even if the rest of the world is falling down.
Ben, how about you next? Are you there, Ben? All right, let's skip Ben, and we have. Oh, you're there. Hey, Ben.
Oh yeah, I just realized it was on mute. Yeah, no, I'm doing fine. Obviously, go back and forth between just being upset by the situation, but also just trying to carry on with my work and feeling fortunate that I do the kind of research and teaching that can be done virtually. So I've been spending basically my whole day on Zoom. Did my first Zoom lecture yesterday, so getting the hang of all these software. But yeah, pretty much just staying home and trying to stay as productive as I can.
Thanks, Ben. Cameron.
Hey, folks. I'm doing well. I will say I am thankful for my parents taking the situation very seriously, as opposed to 2 weeks ago when they still wanted to go to like Home Depot and stuff like that, but they realized that that's not a viable option anymore. So I'm thankful that they're kind of hunkered down, and otherwise staying sane, staying busy, and happy to participate in this.
Nice. Nakia?
Yeah, so I'm definitely trying to lean into being more human. I think that it's hard to be in a situation like this and see everybody really stressed out, because that stress like creates more fractures in the systems that we know are already broken. And so I think that it's really hard to, like, people have a tendency to kind of buckle down and like buckle down harder, and trying to just be more human and see what I can do to advance the idea of some collective visioning on what happens on the other side of this. Like, how can we make a better world after this? So that's where I'm at.
Caitlin?
Yeah. Hey, sorry. Are you talking Caitlin Admire? Is that
Yeah, Caitlin Admire. Hey.
Hi. Yeah, nice to see you guys. I'm glad to be joining you today. I think I will echo Rodrigo in that I was very concerned when we first started all this, just like how we were gonna do it. But I'm really impressed with people's ability to adapt and be flexible and be empathetic with each other. And I'm excited to see how we progress.
Thanks, Caitlin. Kurt, do you want to go next?
Sure. Everything's going well on our side. Getting to see more of my dogs and family than I have for a while, which is a beautiful thing. And I think my dogs will be the most impacted whenever we return to some other new normalcy.
Let's see, Mark.
Hey, everybody. Today is April 1st, so a lot of people are struggling to make their mortgage or their rent. So that weighs heavy on me right now, but the word I would use is appreciative for what I have. I'm also appreciative that nobody's played any April Fool's Day jokes on me, because I'm not a big fan of that at all.
Thanks, Mark. Lucia.
Hi, everybody. I guess I just wanted to say I'm really proud of our team. Our big focus areas right now are keeping the climate plan process moving forward. And then we also have a significant number of people in our office that are focused on emergency food access for the homelessness population and people who are food insecure. And so they're doing a lot of really great work to keep things moving. And then we also have folks supporting communications at the Emergency Operations Center. So I'm grateful for our fantastic team.
Nice, thanks. I missed a 512-585 number that doesn't have a name.
That's me, Alberta.
Hey, Alberta.
So I'm doing okay, and but worried about my family in New York. Also, just trying to. I've never seen so many dogs in Austin in all my life. Every time we walk our dogs and children on bicycles, and my husband and I are doing long bike rides just to try to keep exercise going. Worried about the country, really, especially under the current leadership, and worried about the state of Texas, as we have not gone to a stay-at-home order, and the projections about when we're going to hit our apex, and how we'll deal with that. But other than that, just trying to not go on overload. So, yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Alberta. Brandy?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Gosh, I am juggling a lot. 2 kids at home, new business launch with the Austin Common, trying to help my dad who is facing homelessness again, all sorts of things. I've been volunteering every morning and afternoon on the Community Resilience Trust ATX calls and the strategy calls in the afternoon, and trying to do what we can to make sure that the most vulnerable in our community are taken care of during this crisis. And I am, a little overwhelmed with all of it, but I'm alive and everyone in my house is healthy.
Thanks, Brandy. Jen Krieger?
Hey, everyone. I'm just catching up, so I think we're just sharing one word on how we're feeling, and at the moment, it's pain. I'm get migraines and I don't feel great.
Sorry to hear that, Jen. You?
Yeah, well, being at home made me refocus on some of the things I collected over the past, and I came across this. By the way, I'm healthy. So this says 1993. This says nice people, and it says, well, you can probably read this word, against racism and immigrant violence and stuff. So I've been protesting all my life in large gatherings back home. Can't do that today, but we can still include some of those principles into work. Look forward to continuing what we're doing here.
Let's pull you. Kaiba?
Hey.
Hey.
Well, I guess I'll start with the positive. I'm grateful that I, have a job that is secure and don't have to be stressing about finances right now. But I am pretty stressed out being pregnant and worried about the healthcare system collapsing right about when I have to give birth. So yeah, just, a lot of wakeless nights, and I'm glad that we're getting back to this work, because a lot of the things that I routinely work on aren't the highest priority right now. So it'll be good to delve back into some familiar territory. And just want to also say that I appreciate the work that the Office of Sustainability is doing. I saw some of that work on helping folks get food, and think that's really great. So thanks.
Yeah. Nick?
Hey everyone. Happy to report that everyone in my family is healthy, and my parents are also taking it seriously at this point, which is nice. Like Kaiba, my wife is due for our baby next week.
Oh,
So I
wow.
think that's been at the front of our mind, just kind of both getting ready for that at home and paying very close attention to what's going on in the hospitals. So I guess a pretty heady mix of excitement and fear and a lot of things to keep me busy, but happy to see everyone here today.
Thanks, Nick. Let's see, Carmen. Carmen, are you there? I think you're muted if you're trying to talk. All right, I'll loop back around to Carmen. Lauren.
Hi, y'all. Let's see. I guess if I had to pick one word, it would maybe be scared. But I guess I'm also just thinking, I don't know, as organizers, I feel like I spend a lot of my time reimagining a better world and how all of these new systems can work, and it's normally a space I feel so comfortable in, but I think for me now, it's just being comfortable with rest and knowing that I don't have to be doing that work right now. If it's too hard to kind of imagine the end of this crisis that we're in and what things will look like after, then I don't really have to be doing that.
Yeah. Thanks, Lauren. Shane.
Hey y'all, sorry I came on late. And I'm slightly distracted because I just got an eyelash stuck in my eye. Okay, sorry about that. So, is the prompt basically just kind of check in, how's everybody doing?
Yeah, we were trying to keep it, a sentence or two, a word on how you're feeling. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I think like everybody, a little scared and mind blown. I'd say sort of going between waves of anxiety and depression and feeling some determination and drive and power that I can help, like Lauren was saying, reimagine the world right now. Now's the time. Luckily, my family is all all okay. So my mom does work for Whole Foods, and hopefully y'all have seen the news about lots of people trying to strike because of their terrible company. And that's all for me.
Yeah, thanks, Shane. Solar Leaf really could be anyone. Who's Solar Leaf?
I know, so Rashab, I believe, he emailed me. He saw the posting online and wanted to join. And I'm not sure if he's on mute or wants to say something, but he's a guest joining us today.
Great. What about Jim?
Hi. Which Jim?
Hey, Jim.
Hello. I'm glad this work is continuing. Our UT Austin staff are finding ways to be creative and helping both the students we have in our office, but also elsewhere. But not much, and just grateful for the challenges and opportunities that are arising.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Rashad, were you about to say something?
Oh, just saying hi. I heard my name. Sorry, I was on a work call, so I just got off and I was listening to the whole thing though. I just had to stay on another conference call as well. Kind of gets hard in these times to juggle these calls. Sorry about that. Hey guys.
Hey, Rashad. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
We have a few phone numbers at the bottom of the list. If you haven't gone yet, go for it.
I can go. This is Pooja. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me?
No, go ahead, Pooja. Yep.
This is Pooja. Hi, everyone. I hope that you're all well. I guess I'm okay. I've got two sisters and two brother-in-laws who are healthcare providers. And so I've been pretty stressed about them because they don't have masks a lot of the times for what they're doing. And other than that, just trying to get masks for healthcare providers, and today trying to get census outreach out. So if you haven't done your census, please do it.
Anyone else?
This is Suzanne. Hey, everybody.
Hey.
It's good to hear your voices. I think I'm feeling the same as everybody else, a combination of anxiety and gratitude. I'm excited to be on the call today, and thanks, Zach and the team, for getting the group back together so we can keep making progress.
Thanks, Suzanne. Anyone else?
Hey y'all, this is Drew. Glad to hear everyone's voices. Glad everyone seems to be doing pretty well, all things considered, and looking forward to the discussion today.
Thanks, Drew. Carmen, are you there now?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah.
It's not very happy. So I sent a chat. Thank you so much for letting me on. It's been wonderful experience, and I highlight very nice.
Carmen, it's a little hard to hear you. Sorry, you're breaking up a little bit. All right. Anyone else who hasn't gone yet? Well, I think in the last then. So thanks for taking the time to do that. We only went a few minutes over doing it. I think it's important to make space for us to be empathetic with each other in this weird time. And, you know, I've been really excited to get back into doing this work, especially as I see a lot of folks who are using this crisis to roll back climate and environmental policy at a federal level. And so I think this work is more important than ever. And so I'm happy to be here with you. The silver lining of all this is that I've had some amazing opportunities to connect with friends from college who I haven't talked to in a long time, or who's filling things with my family. So Sunday, we did a family talent show on a video conference, and 8 different cousins or siblings and their kids all did talent show things, and my wife and I performed a song from Hamilton, and I dressed up like I had the old-fashioned wig, but it was toilet paper rolls with cotton balls. So it was something real special that you can picture later and laugh about, that you'll never see a photo of. But on that note, I'm really excited about the advisory group updates today, and so I think that this work that we've been really excited to get to, and I know that those groups have already put in a lot of work to start to develop content for those sections, and so up first, I think we have transportation electrification. So take it away, and I'll go on mute for now.
I'm gonna just pull it up here. Okay, and Zach, just let me know when you want to switch slides.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Katie, for getting everything set up and moving here. So as everybody sees, we're going to go through all 5 of these advisory groups, and the thought is that we're going to try to keep it within 10 minutes or so, and then maybe 5 minutes for questions. And then as we go through this, like if you have a clarification or something that comes to your mind, just type it in the chat box. So if you don't see the chat box, the little bar, you can click, it says conversation, and you can see on the right, there's a running list of chat there. So if you got questions, enter them there. And I realize on each of these, we could probably talk for like an hour on each one of these presentations. So let's do our best to, if you have short questions, let's answer them during the call. If you have longer questions, or if you want to like discuss more things or bigger picture things, just note those things and follow up with me, and I can connect you with the speaker. We can follow up. We can do a more detailed follow up later. But let's try to get through all of these so everybody can just get a snapshot of where we're at, and then we can go from there. Sound good? Okay. So I asked each one of the advisory groups essentially to come up with less than 10 slides, just sort of summarizing like who's been working on their problem, what have they been working on, what is their challenge, what happened during their workshop, and then kind of what direction does it look like they're going from here. Because we're getting to the point where we're going to start jumping in to creating goals and strategies in all these areas. And so now all of the groups have sort of zeroed in on, it's looking like these sort of 3 to 5 top topics that they're going to focus on moving forward. So this really should give everybody a full picture of where we're at now. Okay, so first one here is transportation electrification. This is the group that I've been co-leading with Austin Energy staff. Cameron Freeberg is on the phone. He and I have been leading this group over the past few months. So next slide, Phoebe.
Did that update? I switched it, but I don't know if it's taking a second.
Yeah, it's taking a second. Okay. Should you share it with me? Would that be easier?
Like the link?
No, just like share control. I mean, I just, all I see, we just see the orange slide, transportation electrification update.
Okay.
I think you can, there's a button on your toolbar that should say request control. I think it's easier for you to do that than her to try to give it to you.
Okay.
Okay, I've allowed it.
Okay. Are we to the next slide? No?
Not yet.
I'm seeing the next slide, so that's really weird.
It's still showing Phoebe's screen.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing, and then Zach, if you want to go ahead and just share and pull it up from your.
Okay.
All the presentations are on the Google Drive and I've been able to access them
Yeah.
that way. That might be
We
an
can-
easier way to do it.
We can do that too if necessary. Okay, do folks see my screen now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, are we on to second slide? AG members?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, so that's what we'll do. We'll switch sharing, and then whoever is speaking at the time can just share. Okay, so our group, our advisory group is made up of Austin Energy staff, me, Cat Metro staff, Energy Foundation staff, staff members from UT Austin, Travis County, AISD, Smart Charge America, which is a electric vehicle charging equipment company, Pecan Street, Texetra, which is a local electric vehicle advocacy and lobbying organization, CapCog, and Sunrise Movement. So we've had good participation. Everybody's been coming to all the meetings, so that's good. So our topic, our topic is transportation electrification. We had, the next slide I'm going to hit on this, we had specific council direction from a May resolution to create an EV focused plan. So we have some sort of guidelines and some specific areas that we must focus on in this area. And we're essentially just the EV section of the climate plan is going to become like the community EV plan. So one of our challenges with this work has been to balance Austin Energy directives versus what the city can do versus what businesses and residents can do. This is one of those challenging areas where Austin Energy has been shouldering a lot of the weight of doing incentive programs, trying to push this work forward. But really, for us to reach the massive adoption that's likely going to be needed in this area, the really, really high adoption rates, we're going to have to get a lot more actors involved and active in this space. And that's really essential because with the Austin Energy Generation Plan being implemented, transportation is rapidly becoming the largest emission sector, and on-road single occupant vehicles is the largest will become the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in our community. The next part of this is that, when we really start to look at those transportation emissions as a whole in all of the community, even if we implement all of Project Connect, even if we implement everything in the strategic mobility plan and get to 50% mode split by 2040, there are still going to be hundreds of thousands of cars on the road. And even if we're successful with all those plans. So getting now we have about 11,000 electric vehicles on the road in the Austin area. We're going to need to get that number up into the 100, 200, 300,000 electric cars over the course of the next 10 to 20 years. So this is a huge area of potential growth. So there's a lot that needs to be done in this space. Next slide here. I'm not going to go through all this. This is essentially the text from that resolution back in May 2009. City Council just basically passed this directive that we need to come up with an electric vehicle target. We need to come up with goals. We need to come up with EV building codes, plans for more charging, clarification of roles beyond the city's purview, look at partnerships. This sort of gives us the kind of general roadmap of what we need to focus on in the goals and strategy area of this part of the plan. So you can go back and look at that later if you'd like. So far we've been meeting on the same schedule as everybody else. So far we've had presentations and done a lot of discussion on all of the current Austin Energy programs, their education programs, their rebates, all the data on the number of charging stations they have, where are the charging stations, how much are people using them, all of Austin Energy's work. There's also been presentations on Austin Energy's low income and electric vehicle outreach programs targeted at low income communities. We had a presentation from Cat Metro on bus electrification and kind of where the current state of that is right now. We've had presentation on medium and heavy duty electric vehicles. So looking at the future of delivery vehicles, of big rigs, of dump trucks, of like all of the large equipment stuff and things that are owned in corporate fleets, and what is the status of electrification of that sector right now. After the community workshop, we had a whole session on just like discussing what was done in that and created in that workshop. Our workshop was really successful. We had our last meeting right before we all went virtual. We had a Chevrolet car salesman and the sales manager from Town North Nissan, and we spent 2 hours just talking with them about how are vehicles sold, what is the car business, what does the new car business look like, and just we got a massive amount of information from them on details on how new cars are sold. Then we spent a good amount of time talking about demographics and transportation and where are low-income communities and communities of color in the Austin area. What are the trends with that? What are the intersections of transportation and demographics, and what does that mean? So there's been we had at least a full meeting on that topic. And then this Friday, we have basically our last sort of like learning meeting, which is going to be Dave Tuttle from the UT Energy Institute. He's going to give a presentation on sort of everything he knows about charging and grid connection and all that stuff. So there's been definitely a ton of exploration on this topic. Just to go very briefly through our workshop, on February 4th, we had our community workshop. There were over 60 attendees there. The breakout areas that the group self-created were rebates and affordability, education and outreach, equity and low-income issues, institutional fleets, and then the electric grid and climate impact. So there were a lot of really good takeaways. I mean, when we look back at the notes from that session and from our work session after it, the ideas that came about in that workshop are going to be many of the ideas that I think are going to live all the way through to some of the strategies that we end up proposing. So some of the top ideas were simplifying charging station permitting and incentive programs. There's a lot of complication with doing this right now, and it's got to be made way easier. Focusing on used EVs and incentives and innovative financing options, because right now EVs are really targeted at high income folks who can buy brand new vehicles, and that is not going to work if we're going to get to really high penetration rates. Thinking about parking and toll incentives, thinking about EV sharing programs. Really, there's been a lot of work done on the public charging network and on home charging, but multifamily and workplace charging is a huge opportunity area to grow EVs and EV access, like for the masses, for most people out there. Partnerships with community influencers. There's been a lot of discussion in our group about like, what do cars really mean to people? And many of the folks on this call, your car is just a mechanical thing that you don't like and and costs you money. But to a lot of people in this world, and especially people who like don't own homes, their car and what their vehicle means to them in terms of their status and in terms of like their peers in their life is a really important thing. So understanding how community influencers and how cars meanings for the meaning of a car, how that ends up playing out in this space is going to be really important. And then the last one is just fleet. Things like when you see all the Amazon trucks, when you see all the FedEx trucks, the UPS trucks, school buses, fleet, Cat Metro buses, we need to be doing a lot more to make those conversions happen faster. So just some important insights that we've really run into in this group. The traditional green solution with capitalism of like make solar panels expensive and high income people get them, Teslas, rich white people drive Teslas. That sort of that is stacked against equity and is stacked against like large scale adoption in this area. So we're going to have to figure out solutions that work against that. EVs really can save owners a ton of time and money if we get the charging right and get the vehicle price right and get the right solution in the right person's hands. Let's see. There might be a big opportunity with electric bikes. If any of you have ridden electric bikes, it really makes biking more doable in the summer in Austin. Thinking regionally about this topic, we think is really important because of the way that people of color have been pushed out of the urban area in Austin, and the way that the further you get pushed out, the more that you're spending on gas and commuting time, that there could be real sort of like savings combined there if we're thinking about this regionally beyond just the central Austin area. And then finally, we need to do a lot of work on charging infrastructure and making charging infrastructure simple and easy to do and in new construction, because retrofitting like old buildings and retrofitting stuff is really drives up the cost in this area. Okay, so the last slide here, this is likely sort of where we're going with goals and strategies. So the goal is to really increase electric vehicle miles traveled across these three sectors. So privately owned vehicles, shared mobility services, which that's everything from TNCs to scooters to bikes to vehicle sharing programs. And then the third area is commercial and public vehicle fleets. So everything where there's large numbers of vehicles owned by businesses. So we want to work across those three areas in these three topics. So the three topics are vehicle adoption. So what can we do to spur vehicle adoption and get more vehicles on the road and in the hands of these groups? The next one is charging infrastructure. So if you got the vehicles, you got to have charging infrastructure matched up with it. So how do we maximize the benefit of charging infrastructure, make it simple, make it low cost, and make it, you know, high adoption rates? And then the last one we have here is that there are lots of emerging issues in this area. There are workforce issues with service and training and first responders, and there's lots of new potential jobs that are going to be created in this area, alongside some jobs that will be eliminated over time. So how do we really work on just transition with electric vehicles? End of life for batteries, that's of course a huge one once we start to really get high numbers of vehicles. And then, as I said earlier, really thinking regionally about this and not just about City of Austin is going to be key. So those are the areas where we're going to be coming up with goals and strategies. And I'll leave it there for right now. So we probably have just a couple minutes for questions before we switch to the next group.
Zach, can you see the questions, or do you want me to read them?
Yeah, no, I can see them now.
Okay.
Tax incentives for EV mechanics, that's a good idea. I imagine that will be covered in the workforce area. Hurdles we need to overcome to make V2G work. I imagine that we're going to hear about that when we talk with Dave Tuttle on Friday. The furthest that we've gone right now with V2G is that, you know, using batteries to be plugged in to actually like power things is not, you know, immediately accessible like today. But at the very least, getting smart charging where charging can be used as demand response and you can turn on and turn off chargers through Wi-Fi is probably the most simple and easiest way to move forward, like in the short term. Okay, let's see, scenario planning versus goals. Yoop, if you want to follow up with me on that, at the end of this call, we're going to talk about the working groups going forward. And one of the working groups that we need to restart up is the group that's looking at the goals. So Kevin has come up with this dynamic sort of scenario tool where we can change adoption rates and change speed and timing and show how that affects our greenhouse gas reduction goals in terms of numbers of EVs and how fast they're brought on. So we can show you all that when we have the next working group meeting.
Sorry, can you repeat the question that was just asked?
Oh, the question was, how is scenario planning of EVs versus goals coming along?
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So Kevin's created like a dynamic model with these curves, and you can adjust the curves and timing and adoption rates and all that, and see the effect that it has on community-wide emissions. So folks will be impressed.
Is that linked in anything or in the drive?
It's not yet. Kevin is still, he's probably about halfway done building it all out.
Oh, okay, cool,
There's an E section, and then he's building in like public transport and all the other things. And so it will be a thing that we can work through as a group.
Sounds good.
Coming soon. Okay. We want to switch to the next group. And if anybody has follow-up questions, just follow up with me and we'll loop you in on the EV conversation.
I have a perspective that I would like to share that, and maybe this is just a question y'all take up, is that from my perspective, like, given equity issues and, you know, what vehicles mean different things, different people, like, to me, that widespread uptake in an equitable way isn't going to happen without governmental programs, such as, you know, maybe it's a used EV program. And if that's going to happen on a local level, I don't think that's financially possible unless, like, the property tax cap that the Texas government put out is repealed. So that's just maybe an idea to be thinking about or context to be aware of.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, are we moving on to transportation and land use?
I think we are.
Okay. So this is going to be exciting because I don't know how to request control. I think Mark's going to help me out a little bit.
No. So down on the bar, you'll see a little thing that says an arrow. It says share. So if you click share, then it will share your screen, and then you can show where the presentation on your. There we go.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
It looks like it's
All right.
pulled up.
All right.
Kia,
So
let me know when
Mark's gonna help me
to switch the slides.
Okay, so we are transportation and land use, and I think it's funny that we're coming after Zach, because Zach is like, we've got to get these electric cars on the road, and we're like, we got to get all of these cars off of the road. Yeah, we're doing transportation and land use, which is an interesting combination, and we've got a lot of folks working on this, but it's because we have so many different perspectives, it's been a really interesting discussion. So Mark, if you want to move to the next slide. Also, I'm probably not going to take 10 minutes. I'm a very succinct person, but that means that you'll have more time for questions, and I'm happy to answer them. What we're trying to do is we came up with a vision of a very specific thing because we needed to have a specific goal. And so we'll tell you about that. We'll tell you a little bit about who was involved in trying to wrangle transportation and land use. Like I said, we've got a lot of different perspectives. We'll talk about the foundation that we've used so far. Excuse me, about the history of Austin and the people who have presented to us, so that you have a good idea for the context that we began with. And then what we've decided to kind of narrow it down to, transportation and land use is huge, and we could talk about them, each of them, for an hour and have so many different, very detailed suggestions and prescriptions, but we really wanted to narrow it down and figure out what we're going to focus on, and then kind of some next steps going forward, which will be interesting considering the pandemic, and we've talked about that a little bit as well. Next slide, please. So when we were coming up with a statement to try to figure out like what specifically it is that we're trying to do, we wanted to be really inclusive in this. And so we came up with, we wanted to cultivate a person-centered network of complete communities that meets the needs of low-income people of color ages 0 to 100. So we really leaned into the idea of inclusivity because we want to make sure that this is a place that everyone can be, where everyone has a feeling of belonging and home, and that it's really specifically person-centered. So we didn't want it to be economically centered. We didn't want it to be entertainment-centered. We want it to be people-centered and have a really holistic view of how people interact in these spaces, and like how can we make spaces and city centers and transportation that is focused on how people will use them and how people need to have them in our lives, instead of on like a model that's like, okay, well, how much money can we spend or save with this, or how can we do other things? And so that person-centered idea includes lots of green spaces. It includes accessibility. It includes thoughtfulness, and like how we are putting things in place. So, and if y'all have, oh, actually, wait, no, go back, Mark. You're on it. Mark, do you want to say anything about the complete communities?
No, I think you covered it. Thank you.
Oh, all right. Okay. The next slide, please. So we have a lot of folks who are a part of this group. I feel like we're really blessed for that. So everyone from the Austin Neighborhood Council, and some of us wear multiple hats, right? To the Movability Board, to Rouser Roundtable. We've got a lot of different folks who are putting in input into the solutions that we're creating. And so we've had some really rich discussions, and like not all of them have been on the same page or in full agreement, but I feel like that means that we're gonna be able to have solutions that are tested, that we've thought about what are some of the unintended consequences from this, and that are able to work for Austin. So next slide, please. So what we've discussed, so we've had Carmen Llanes come in and talk to us about the racial history of Austin, from redlining to school closings, and kind of a little deeper than what Tane went into how Austin has gotten to where we are right now. And we were lucky enough to have some people in the group who have been in longtime Austinites who are able to provide some personal anecdotal stories as well. We've talked about Austin's demographics, from racial demographics to socioeconomic status by request, and not just like where are the maps of like who has money and who doesn't, but also like what are the percentages of people in Austin who are making above $200,000 or making between $0 and $50,000. So we've talked a lot about demographics, and in order to be able to figure out who is going to get hit by the solutions that we provide, and if we are looking at providing a solution for people who are making $125,000, how does that look different for providing a solution for people who are making $35,000, right? So like, how are we taking into account who this is for so that people can use these systems? We've looked at other city plans. We had Llanes talk to us about Project Connect. So we've had a lot of good foundational information coming in. And then we've also specifically talked about a little bit further on visioning. And so what do we think transportation should look like in the future? A lot of us had free and easily accessible, and some really amazing like Pollyanna kind of things, which was really helpful. And we actually did some research, because there was a little while where Austin was providing free services, and kind of like, what happened with that? Why aren't we doing that anymore? Like, what went wrong with that? We talked about the community workshop, and I'll give you a little bit more information on that in the next slide. We had conversations about facilitated, or the big moves and the first moves, so more of the kind of Pollyanna, like what would you want, pie in the sky, and then what are our first steps to get towards that. And then we talked about how we can rethink transportation in this world now with coronavirus, and we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. Next slide, please. So our community workshop had about 35 folks there. We wanted to make sure that we were able to source some good ideas from people. And so we had a lot of different breakout areas. People had some disparate ideas of what we wanted to discuss. So we talked about active walking and biking, land use, and I feel like I'll mention it here, but land use is such a large topic. It's kind of like being like, oh, let's talk about the economy. And it seems like it's so opaque and kind of a thing that a lot of people don't feel like they have firsthand knowledge of being able to discuss. And so we've definitely run into that. A lot of the times when we're talking to community, we're talking about transportation because almost everybody can go, yes, I have had the experience to get in a car and go to a place, or I've tried to wait for the bus and like, this is what I think about that, or like I've gotten on these trains. So we've talked, so people really tend to focus on that because they feel like they can speak to it, but it's been harder to source community input regarding land use because I think there's a lot of people who feel like it's just something that like they don't understand quite well enough to be able to give good input on. And so for land use, we've mostly been talking about housing. But even in the breakout areas, you can see that like a lot of what we're talking about is land use. For the fourth breakout area, open space, connectivity, green spaces, and planting stuff, almost all of that was natural systems. And so we end up kicking off some of that information to the other group because we felt like it was more in their boat. So we had big moves and first moves. We talked about addressing conflict between gentrification, equity, and implementation of actions. So such as bike lanes, and when bike lanes seems to be the obvious idea, right? Like the obvious answer to a lot of things, and a good way to make inroads, terrible pun, into communities. But it's also a sign of gentrification, and it makes people nervous and it makes people anxious about like, oh, okay, we've got bike lanes. These are not bike lanes for me and my people. These are bike lanes that are set up like you're making the place nice for the folks who are going to be coming in and taking my house and taking over my neighborhood. And so like, how do we balance that? Making a transit system that fits our city. So we've talked about making it the easy choice. We've talked about making it the most obvious choice. There are some places that you show up, like for instance, if you go to Oakland, the BART is right there, and that's what everybody takes. It's the easiest choice. It's the obvious choice. It will get you places faster than you would get otherwise if you're talking about a car or whatever, and it's very well integrated. And so how can we get a transportation system that is integrated on that level? Let's see. We want to be able to finish the plans that we already have. So there's a lot of plans around equity, there's a lot of plans around climate change, there's a lot of plans around land use and transportation, and the overlaps of those that are sitting somewhere or are half finished. And so how can we finish the plans that we already have? Balancing increasing density with factors that motivate gentrification. And obviously, how can we make sure to bring people of color really strongly into this conversation? How, like, people of color, the people who are going to be the most impacted by this, how can we make sure that we are that those voices are heard and amplified? And then when we're thinking about cities and how people navigate them, how are large employers also involved in this conversation? Next slide, please. So we end up whittling some things down. So the focus areas that we end up doing after all of these conversations are talking about increasing transit ridership, increasing people-powered transportation, and decreasing the need to drive alone. So once we've come up with these things, and then we had shelter in place. And so one of the things that we're really looking at now is how do we take our new situation and incorporate that into transportation? Because if you're talking about right now, what's happened is like for transportation, our carbon footprint has gone way down, right? Because people aren't commuting to work in the same ways as they were before. And so how how do we leverage that going forward? What will this look like in a year? Will we still be having so many folks who are working from home? How does that play into what we're doing? And also, if we are in an age where we are going to have more pandemics and more climate change, how does having a transportation system where you can do social distancing work? What does that even look like? So we've got a lot of new challenges to kind of explore and deep dive in when it comes to what transportation looks like in a post-COVID world. And then for land use, we're focusing on right to stay, right to return, right to own. So really working on housing that will be gentrification resistant. We are looking at communal housing and affordable housing. How can we have communities who are living closer together? Like, what does that look like for Austin? Transit and pedestrian oriented development. So like, how are we making it easy for people to be able to like use those people-powered transportation modes to get from place to place? Like, how can we make an Austin where it's easier and faster to get to some place, to get to across the city on bike than it is via car? We talked about the regional activity center. So that one's one where the idea is that you can do all of the things that you need to do within a 1 to 2 mile radius, maybe a 3 mile radius. But like, how can you go to your place of employment, get your entertainment, get all your services, and be able to walk home? How can we have city centers that will allow us to be able to limit the amount of cross-city transportation that we need to have? And then how can we incorporate green space into all of this? Not just parks, but walkways and housing. We've talked a lot about being able to have bike trails and walking trails that really have a lot of greenery, and being able to have Town Lake not be the main source, but be able to have something that feels like that in other places in the city, and not just corridors so that you can just take a walk, but corridors that allow you to be able to get to work, to get to the store, to get home, along a bike trail where you've got green space that you can use for entertainment and for practical purposes. Next slide. Wait, is that our last slide? We've got like, yeah, there we go, next steps. So we're going to continue to do working groups to define those 3 goals and to go deeper into what those specifically look like for transportation. And then after that, we're going to be doing some working groups similarly for the land use topics. I have no idea how I'm doing on time. Do people have questions? Mark, do you have anything you want to add?
No, I think you did a fantastic job. Thank you.
Oh, wait, I'm supposed to be looking at the chat for questions. Sorry, I'm terrible at this.
I just had a comment, Nakia, while you're looking at those questions, if you don't mind.
Yeah,
it's great. Thank you so much for going through this. And I guess I was curious, in the context of COVID-19, I think, the infrastructure that is needed to support folks working from home in terms of having close to home parks and having opportunities to socially distance in safe ways, but still, have access to supportive services without leaving your neighborhood is very much like a complete community's idea. And I guess I'm curious about how, from a transportation perspective, if y'all have talked about, work from home as an opportunity to reduce transportation use that is single car, single occupant commuting.
Yeah, so that's what a lot of our last conversation was. That's not true. We kind of dived into it at the beginning of our last meeting about like what does this look like? Because like you said, like right now we're all home, right? Like we're in our houses, and what is that going to continue a year from now? Is that going to be here like 10 years from now? This is an opportunity to be able to see like what we can actually be doing from home. So like there's a lot of employers who are like, oh no, we can't work from home because of like reasons or logistics. And so like how do we kind of encourage people to encourage those organizations or those corporations to continue to allow people to work at home for this, because that's a very, very different model. And so I think that part of this is being able to be really flexible, because we don't know what's coming down the pike, and like we're not going to know for sure 2 months from now or 4 months from now when we need to be able to have some concrete solutions. So I think that what we're trying to do is figure out some options that will kind of when looking at the focus areas about increasing transit ridership, or like increasing people-powered transportation and the need to drive alone, how are we accounting for like kind of both situations, either a full force return to like everybody's going back to work? How do we account for something that's like that, or something that's got a lot more work from home options? Does that answer your question?
Thanks.
I have a comment, or maybe a question to consider. Thank you, Nakia, for the overview. That was awesome. So I don't know if y'all saw that, like, starting in April, Cap Metro is not going to be charging fares. And I think part of the rationale for that is, one, you can minimize like the need to exchange money or make contact with the driver, but also like they've realized that the people who still need to use transit right now are probably low income folks who have to go to work and be there in person. So they're trying to reduce like the financial stress that they're one of the sources of financial stress among all the others that they're dealing with right now. And I'm wondering if like fares and like reduction or removal of fares is something that's going to be talked about or has been talked about.
So that's a really great question. So yes, we've talked about it at length. Like I said, the Austin has done this a little bit. I don't remember for how long. I think it was maybe 3 months, where they just didn't have any fares for the bus system. And the complaint was that folks who were experiencing homelessness would just be on the bus all day. And so I think that it's actually kind of fortuitous that we are land use and transportation, because if you have housing for people, then they don't have to be on the bus all day. They can just be in their homes. And so like, how are we meeting the needs of all of the people who are in Austin? So we really want free public transportation. And I think that we're gonna have to figure out a way to do that while changing some of the other systems that we have here in Austin, because I think that there are definitely people who would be like, yeah, I'm totally fine with folks who are experiencing homelessness being on the bus. But there, as we saw with when we banned criminalization of homelessness, like there are a lot of people who are not comfortable with folks experiencing homelessness in and around their businesses or establishments or transit. So having to figure out what that balance looks like. And then I'm also reading Jennifer's comment on the chat. So we did talk a little bit about how right now is an excellent time to change people's behavior, right? Like we've all been disrupted from our patterns. And so when we go back to work is a kind of an opportunity for a clean slate. Like what do we want to draw? How do we want to frame people's response to transportation? But the likelihood is that we're going to be going back to work before these suggestions get implemented. And so I think it's less about being able to have specific suggestions and specific things that will be able to jumpstart that, and more like how do we, and this is something that we haven't talked a whole lot about, but these are just my thoughts, and so Mark, please jump in. But like, how do we change the conversation right now? How do we set people up for that when it happens? Does that answer both of y'all's questions? Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, awesome. I'm pretty sure I'm over time at this point. Are we good?
Yeah, I think we're good. That was fantastic, Nakia. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Thank y'all.
Awesome.
And, yeah, and again, and if folks have other questions, make sure you're writing them in the chat so that we can track them. Okay, we have consumption next.
Yeah, hi there, everybody. This is Jen. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. So as I mentioned at the start, I don't feel great right now. So my energy levels are lower than normal. So I apologize for that. Brandy, if you're still on the line, if you want to jump in at any point and add a little extra pep to this, that is more than welcome. Okay, so I am here to talk about our work so far with the Consumption Advisory Group. Here's a snapshot of kind of the various organizations that are represented on our group. Like the others, we do have a pretty broad cross-section. I will point out that I think one of the things I'm noticing so far on the first three kind of descriptions of who's in our groups, and I know Brandy's brought this up in the past, is that business is pretty underrepresented. So we do have one kind of small consulting firm for somebody that works in the sustainable fashion industry, but for the most part, it is kind of government and social goods service providers that are participating on our team, which is awesome and valuable perspective, and I'm so glad they're participating. But I will just kind of put in a plug that we need to continue to make sure that we're incorporating the private sector's perspective in all of this as well. And also just to mention that we have two representatives who regularly participate in these steering committee meetings, Karen Magid with Houston Tillotson and a variety of other organizations, and Brandy Clark-Burton as well. Our big picture, what we're focused on is we're really trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the foods and goods that we consume here locally in Austin, while improving racial equity here as well. And just to state the obvious, we think this work is really important. Here are a few statistics that I won't read all of them to you, but these are things that we shared and that came up during our community workshop a couple months back. But in short, we're trying to simultaneously acknowledge and address the fact that Austin remains one of the most racially and economically segregated cities. And that really shows up when we're talking about all of the things that we buy and consume on a regular basis. There are pretty strong disparities in consumption patterns depending on your income, for sure. And that, no surprise, we're all aware that as our current COVID-19 situation is showing us, is that we are overconsuming our resources. We are consuming at a rate faster than the earth can generate for us. And that is showing up in myriad ways in various forms of pollution. And it also shows up in just the way that we treat people and the people that create all of the food and products that we consume on a day-to-day basis. Like all the groups, we've had a variety of kind of knowledge sharing sessions. So this is a snapshot of the various topics that we've heard about so far. So we kind of started off acknowledging that our group is showing up for the first time, kind of our topic area is showing up for the first time in this revision to the climate plan. It wasn't in the 2015 version, and that partially reflects just the journey that all local governments are on, trying to better understand the ways that their communities and their government operations create greenhouse gas emissions and contribute to environmental and social issues in their communities. And one of the things that's starting to show up is just the way that we actually measure our carbon footprint, so the emissions that we create from our day-to-day activities. It's shifting from more of a what are we directly producing from the tailpipe and the manufacturing plant and the power plant within our city boundaries, to regardless of where the goods and services and food that we consume here in Austin, regardless of where it's made and transported from and ultimately disposed of, that we as Austinites are responsible for the environmental and equity impact of that. And so we talked a little bit about just the different tools and methodologies that are available. They are definitely in their infancy, so our data quality could certainly stand to improve, but we're trying to have data infused throughout our kind of decision-making process as we move into the recommendation phase of what we're working on. We also did just a little bit of kind of informal research, kind of gauging local perspectives from our peers on their consumption patterns, questions that they have, opportunities that they see to lessen the impact on the things that they buy and consume, as well as the feedback that we'll get into a little bit from the community workshop. As I mentioned earlier, local governments' perspectives on and knowledge of how we address the embedded environmental and social impact of all the things we consume is really in its infancy, and we're learning. But there are a couple of state and local governments, namely in the Pacific Northwest and in California, that are a bit ahead of us on this. And so we pulled in a couple policy examples from them. We've spent a fair amount of time talking about one potential way to address the things that we consume overall, and that is shifting more from this kind of linear economy where we extract things from the earth, we consume them, and we put them back into the earth in the form of a landfill. And it's just very linear. Things aren't circulated back into the system. And so one of the things that is emerging for us is this idea of shifting from that linear perspective into a much more circular perspective where waste is designed out of the system, and we try to keep products circulating for as long as possible before disposing of them at some point. So we've had some background on what does that mean to have a circular economy? What is the city already doing to encourage this circular economy and zero waste practices through policy and programs? At our last meeting, we had a handful of mostly startup mode local businesses that are practicing circularity and zero waste in their business models to learn kind of their lessons learned and some of their recommendations for us as we're considering potential policy changes. We did a deep dive on 2 specific product areas, both fashion in the form of clothing and home textiles, looking at the full life cycle environmental equity impacts of that industry, as well as the food system as a whole. And then we got a little bit of a taste for how the city of Austin's purchasing works in particular, and some of the foundational work that they're doing, starting to put in place some sustainability practices and requirements. That said, this is a really tough nut to crack. And as I mentioned earlier, that equity divide shows up very strongly in this area. As really any area. So these are just some of like the really bigger, thornier issues that we're still thinking through and still trying to consider, and will consider as we move into setting our goals and developing our strategies for how we're going to reach those goals. So one is just this, a little bit of this tension in acknowledging that we really want to provide ideas and actions that can empower individuals to make change at their own individual and household level, while also recognizing that the biggest responsibility and the biggest potential for impact really happens at the larger kind of producer and institutional level. So those people that are making all the products and foods that we consume, and the large institutions that really have those economies of scale and their purchasing power. Also critically important is how do we help everyone consume what they need to not just survive, but thrive, while encouraging those high carbon footprint individuals to consume less, to consume differently. And so just kind of acknowledging that there is no one size fits all approach to this, that we have to allow for variations depending on where people are in their current consumption patterns and the associated impact with those consumption patterns. As I alluded to earlier, the data quality isn't great in this area yet. So how do we continue to improve the measurability and actually track our progress of any consumption-driven policy changes that we recommend? And then just as we are shifting into that goal setting and strategy development mode, starting to think about how we organize our work. And one of the discussions that we've started to touch on is, does it make sense to really focus our efforts and our time and our energy on very specific types of food, say meat, or types of products that have a higher carbon footprint than others? Or is the data quality not quite there enough and the differences in how we would approach the impact of different types of foods and products not distinct enough to really worry about the details, so to speak. Like, should we focus instead more on what policy and behavior changes can we put in place that apply systematically and that apply across different types of food and different types of products? So our workshop, we were the very last of the 5 community workshops, so we got to benefit from everybody's lessons learned, and I also think we got to benefit from the fact that word had really gotten out about all these workshops. So we had a great turnout. We had somewhere north of 70 people in attendance. We met, Travis County hosted us in their administration building downtown on 7th and Lavaca. It was a fabulous space. I would definitely recommend it for future public events. It was, there were some hoops to jump through to get approval to use it as a non-county organization, but it was definitely worth it. We met on a Sunday afternoon and we kind of dove into the topics here on the screen, just again acknowledging that there's a role for the companies, the producers that are making these products. There's a role for us as consumers. There was definitely some interest in both circular economy and zero waste topics, and specifically addressing kind of our fast fashion industry, plastics overall. And then interesting, this kind of like crossed over in the natural system space, but folks also wanted to talk about landscaping and how that drives a lot of consumption of fuels and different types of landscaping equipment and things along those lines. So when it came down to it, looking across those various breakout groups, while they were thematically and topic driven, they were different. We really found that the common takeaways was that transforming what is admittedly a very consumption-driven society, a very materialistic, capitalistic system, that's going to take some massive structural change that's going to require both producer and consumer responsibility, with a hearty role for government to intervene as well. So just kind of up here bulleted on the screen here, just some of the key takeaways under each of those categories. I think in the interest of time, I won't go into all of them, but just try to summarize that essentially across the board, there was interest in greater transparency throughout the whole life cycle of the products and foods that we consume, that there was a call for more and better education and awareness building around the impacts of all the things that we consume on a daily basis. And I think one of the things that was really showing up for me, and I think for some of the other city staff, was that a lot of the educational ideas that were brought up exist in some form or fashion in a city program. And so to me, that was just kind of a big flag that the city needs to be doing a better job promoting and providing access to its programs. There was also a common theme of essentially rewarding good behavior, rewarding the businesses and the individuals that are practicing a shared economy, circular economy, zero waste model, and discouraging those who aren't. And so at the individual level, that looks like, using your purchasing power, your money talks, where you spend your resources. And at the government level, that looks at like various kind of financial incentives that we might be able to put in place. And then I think the last thing I would point out there that kind of showed up across all the producer, consumer, and government categories was just acknowledgement that we live in a state that selectively allows for local control. And a lot of this stuff is going to take the local government deviating from the norm at the state level. And that's tough to do in our political environment. So what is the role for advocacy, not just at the local level, but at the state level? This is not showing up well. I apologize. There's I think a missing piece to this slide, but just trying to pull this all together, both from the knowledge sharing sessions that we've had with our advisory group meetings and the workshop. I think one of the emergent themes is just this idea of moving away from our take, make, waste linear economy to a more circular economy, where we acknowledge and address the full life cycle impact of the foods and goods that we consume, all the way from the point of, kind of like I mentioned before, resource extraction from the earth through the manufacturing, transportation, down to the retail distribution level, and then as it enters our homes and businesses and other buildings, to how do we get rid of it at the end of life or put it back into the system to continue that circular trend. So I think, oh, look, there it is. There was the missing graphic, sorry about that. I think that is at least shaping my thoughts around how the Consumption Advisory Group can organize ourselves moving forward into the goal setting and strategy development phase. I want to put a big old caveat on what you're seeing on this slide here, which is that only 3 other advisory group members have seen this, and only 1 has had the chance to comment on it. So this is not fully vetted, this is not fully agreed to by the group, but this is what we're going to be talking about at our next meeting this coming Monday. So kind of the proposal on the table is that maybe we break our advisory group into 3 smaller subgroups, 1 addressing the full life cycle impact of food, another one addressing the full life cycle impact of at the individual level, the consumer goods that we consume, and then a 3rd group looking at the full life cycle impact of the types of products and things that are purchased at a larger institutional level, acknowledging that there's probably some different policy and kind of behavioral approaches between individual actions and large organization actions. So we're going to be asking each of those groups, or whatever the group decides on as a whole, to kind of set specific, actionable, quantifiable goals reached by 2025 or 2030 for each of those topic areas, and then to really call out where within that full circle supply chain is the opportunity for us to intervene, where can we make a difference here at the local level, and who are the key parties that are going to be responsible for that. So that's what I have for you guys.
I had a question. Well, actually, first, I guess it's a question / suggestion. I know you have some folks from the Zero Waste Advisory Commission on there, and ARR. I know ARR has stakeholder list that they contact when there's different city ordinances or changes being considered. Have they done that so far? You mentioned that there weren't really business interests reflected on the group, but having some stakeholder meetings, with, say, restaurants or other, grocery stores, whatever, could be really, I think, helpful. I found that to be useful in our work on that commission.
Unless people are self-organizing, I don't believe that we've done that yet collectively as a group, but I think it's a good idea. I'll have to think about how we can put that in with our timeline and our virtual world, but I think that could be really valuable. So I appreciate that.
Also just actually related, the Austin Resource Recovery Master Plan that's getting updated right now has some of those folks already, and so I wonder if we could, if those are still moving. So we're doing a few of them as a firm, and helping out the prime with like a handful of them, but there are going to be a lot of interviews with the folks you're talking about, other institutional partners. So Jennifer, I wonder if I could connect you with the Austin Resource Recovery folks and see if you could just share data from those.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. Elizabeth Nelson, who is with Resource Recovery, she's on our group and kind of one of the staff liaisons with me, so I can definitely bring that up. She has been providing just some insight into what the master plan development process looks like, and then the plan is like things that come out of this group that fit better in end of life management, that kind of gets fed over into the master plan process. But yes, I agree. Let's not hit up the same folks if they're already convening under a separate initiative.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea to use that, whatever data is being collected and input that is coming out of that process. But I know that they have a pretty extensive network of contacts. So I would, I don't know how many of them are involved in that process, but for example, when we're trying to, make some changes around recycling or composting at multifamily, getting those folks that are actually not just with the apartment association, but other, multifamily providers in the room to talk about their specific challenges and opportunities is really helpful. And I could imagine the same thing, being really useful for, restaurants, which is a major source of, I guess, linear trash in our community here. And then I guess kind of on a related topic, one of the things that I'd be interested to hear from those businesses is if the city were to take a more proactive role in, say, bulk purchasing of certain goods, biodegradable takeout containers and the like, and therefore, maybe get a better price than a lot of the smaller restaurants and whatnot could get on those things. Is that something that people would take advantage of? Because it seems challenging to do it one by one. There are so many and they're constantly changing. So just a suggestion there.
Yeah, that's come up, K-Bill, addressing this other comment from Katie about like what does the city-county coordination look like and kind of the bigger picture regional climate efforts. And Tom Gleason, who's the sustainability kind of lead over there at the Travis County, he's on the consumption advisory group as well. And that's one of the ideas that he brought up, more focused on things that local governments buy for local government use. But I do think it's also worth looking into, can we use local government's purchasing power for products that can be used on a retail level? I'm not entirely sure like the legality of all of that, just because procurement rules are so confusing, but I know it's certainly something that's been brought up around EVs, for example. So worth looking into. Thank you.
Thanks.
And I saw the comment about intro to Stacey Savage. I am familiar with Stacey and would be happy to chat with her. She's not officially on the group at this point. Stack for any discussions with
to move on to the other groups.
Okay.
And still have to revisit questions, but so we only have 15 minutes left. So sustainable buildings and natural systems are left. Zach, is it doable to do those each in like 12 minutes?
Yeah, it's doable.
All right, great, thanks.
All right, Caitlin and Phoebe, take it away.
Can y'all see my slides this time?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'll try to be quick. So basically our group is composed of various actors from the local government sector, both City of Austin and Travis County, trade associations, nonprofit and community organizations. We've got quite a few industry folks from engineering and architecture firms, and we have education representation from UT and AISD. And so y'all have access to the slide and you can go over this full list. Okay. So our starting point here, y'all may have seen this slide before. There are, quite a few topics that the generation plan itself is covering, and those of you who were able to attend the meeting, you saw the overview from Kurt and Erica. But basically, the overall starting point for us is that, as the electric grid is becoming decarbonized, it's more important to start looking at additional avenues for emissions reduction. And this is from a carbon perspective. Of course, there are so many different things to consider when we think about equity and racial equity and all of the other social justice kind of lens situations when it comes to this topic. But we also needed to think about looking at scope 3 emissions. So, tying it back to Jen's topic about embodied carbon. So the materials that go into a building. Yes.
Maybe you're still on the title slide.
Okay.
I think, would you try to do, to have it actually go to slideshow?
Yeah, so that's what I've been doing. I'm not sure why.
Is it on a separate screen for you?
No, let me just, okay. Oh,
if you want to, I can just share for you, Phoebe.
Yeah, I'm not sure why that's doing that. I haven't had issues with this before, but I'll stop sharing, and if you want to just pull it up for me, Zach.
All right.
Okay, so if you want to just quickly go to the second slide, please.
That good?
Yes, so those are the organizations that I mentioned earlier. I won't tie back too much of this. I did mention that Kurt from Austin Energy is our steering committee representative, and then you can see all the different organizations that are involved. We've had really great attendance so far in the meeting, so people are staying engaged. We can go to the next slide. So this is what I was talking about when I mentioned, there are things that the Austin Energy Resource Generation and Climate Protection Plan touched on, and then we had some additional topics to look at from that. And I think from a carbon perspective, we wanted to also think about the embodied carbon or the scope 3 emissions of all of the materials that are going into the brand new buildings that we're seeing pop up in the city, constantly and at a growing rate. So we'll go to the next slide. And so what we've learned so far, we did have an overview of, just Austin Energy Green Building. What are some of the local codes and ordinances that we're currently using for, within the city right now that are city programs. We had a Codes 101 lesson from SPEAR. We had presentations from NHCD on affordable housing, and then had foundation communities talk about their own portfolio and how they make decisions on building their buildings at pretty green, pretty energy efficient rates. And so then we had also had a presentation on embodied carbon, which incorporated a conversation on the health impacts of building materials and the toxicity. And that's a topic that I didn't know a whole lot about, but it's something that I think we're going to incorporate. And how do we balance having low carbon materials while also thinking about what we're putting into our buildings and the health implications of that. We had a refrigerants overview, which is actually not something that was previously in our inventory for greenhouse gas emissions, but it's something that I think we can certainly tackle, and that I think we're going to try to incorporate into our metrics. We recently had a presentation on the Better Builder program from Workers Defense Project, and I've highlighted some of these terms because I think these cover kind of some of the themes that we're going to talk about with the group, or what we're going to focus on. We talked about electrification, and then of course had a presentation from Austin Energy and from the Austin Water folks on their 100-year water forward plan. And then we also had a conversation about demographic information and disparities that we see in education. And if we're talking about workforce development, what does that mean? What is the lay of the land that we have, and how can we use that information to build our strategies? And so in our next meeting, we are also going to have the Austin Area Urban League present on their home repair program. And we have Miriam Solis, who works at UT Austin and is helping consult and evaluate the EcoRise LEAD high school internship program. That was one of the organizations that received the Green Jobs Grant. So we're really looking forward to that. Next slide. And we did have a community workshop on February 11th at Houston Tillotson University. We had between 45 to 50 attendees and had 6 different breakout groups. One really focused on existing buildings, really a conversation on old buildings and how to work on improving buildings that have a lot of structural issues, and what is the cost associated with that. We did have an equity group that was affordability. There was a lot of conversation about community input on that as well. We had a whole group dedicated to building materials and more of the embodied carbon perspective. We did have 2 groups that this is where the interconnectedness of all our topics comes into into play, because we did have a whole group that wanted to talk about natural systems within buildings, and we had a group that wanted to talk about transit-oriented neighborhoods. And so we wanted to let the community decide what they wanted to focus on, and so we saw the importance of that, and it just brings about the importance of making sure that we're connecting across the different groups and ensuring that there's nothing that gets left behind in between all these different topics, and not be siloed. And then of course we had a whole group focused on energy in general, so that's electrification, energy efficiency, solar, etc. So next slide. So I, categorized these workshop takeaways. We had a lot of talk about new buildings. How can we what can we incentivize and what can we code? We're working within a very particular regulatory environment in Texas, and so that means that certain things can't be coded, or banned. We have to be flexible and we have to be creative in the way that we do things. With existing buildings, there's a lot that the Austin Energy programs are doing in regards to their goals. But there's, of course, still the awareness factor. How much do people know about the existing programs? How much are they being used? How much do people have access to their data? This is something that foundation communities said it was one of their most important strategies that has helped them with decision making and with decreasing their energy costs, is just having a benchmarking, some sort of system that they can see how much energy they're using on a month-to-month basis. And then, thinking about split incentive, how can we incentivize a renter that doesn't own a building? And how can we incentivize a landlord that doesn't pay the bill? And, all of the different players that are in the industry and have different interests at hand. Then, of course, there's workforce development that has consistently come up, I think, with a lot of our groups. But when we talk about workforce development, we need to think about who has disparate outcomes in education and who, can benefit the most from these types of programs. And so really trying to diversify the industry and then work with organizations like Workers Defense Project and local unions to ensure that, the jobs that are being created are also fair and just and well paid. I talked a little bit about cross-group collaboration, and, that's just making sure that we're working across the different topics. And then a big point on community engagement. Can we actually have an incentive system that specifically targets businesses that are owned by communities of color that have been in Austin for a long time, that are vulnerable to displacement? Is that something we can do? Can we have neighborhood level outreach, kind of on the ambassadors concept, people who have trust from their community that can teach them about the different programs that are available? Are we ensuring that our marketing materials and, voices are reflecting the actual community? And then, from a very philosophical, political standpoint, how are we making decisions? Who is able to attend city council meetings? Who is able to vote? Just from a very kind of high level perspective, how can we as a city facilitate government participation? So next slide. This is a, high level overview. That little part kind of messed up a little bit, but basically, when we think about all the different topics and how we can address them, this is a way that I try to organize. It's by no means all fully inclusive or final, but we need to think about codes. We need to think about these various topics. We need to think about the affordability aspect, and then of course how people are affected. Either from a health perspective, from a workforce development perspective. The types of incentives we have and how we can reduce costs and all of that. And so this was just a way to try to wrap my head around how refrigerants tie back to, humans, because some of these topics are very technical. And I think that it can be difficult to try to think about how they can be incorporated, how equity can be incorporated in them. But I think, if we dig through the equity tool, we can find that there's connections to make across all of them. So next slide. Okay, so some considerations moving forward. Once again, not fully inclusive, but what are the 2 to 3 goals? We've got so many issues that we need to think about when it comes to buildings. So how are we going to narrow down to be to these final goals? And then finally, how are we going to ensure that we're incorporating equity and that we're maximizing community engagement and maximizing partnerships with organizations? What about resilience? This isn't a resilience plan, but there are so many aspects of resilience, community resilience, climate resilience that are important to this work. So that is a consideration that I think we have to take. And then, how do we quantify things? There's strategies for quantifying embodied carbon and reduction of materials. There's, Kevin has done a lot of research on that, and we've had conversations, but it is challenging because it's very emerging. And then, once again, regulatory funding considerations. How are we going to be effective, creative, have foresight in a way and in something that's brand new, right? And then, of course, how can we continue to collaborate and have a cohesive vision across all the different strategies? So that's me right there.
Thanks, Phoebe. That's great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Phoebe. I think if you have questions, please post them in the chat, and I'd like to get to our natural resources group before the call's over because we're running out of time. Does that sound okay with folks?
Sounds good.
Great.
All right,
You
thanks.
ready to go, Caitlin? Can you see the slides?
Yep, I can see them. So I'm guessing that means everyone else can. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Caitlin Admire. I'm with the Office of Sustainability, and I am one of the staff leads for the Natural Systems Advisory Group, along with Matt Holland and Mateo Scoggins with Watershed. So I am going to fly through these pretty quickly and keep it pretty high level, but I'm happy to follow up via email or separate calls. So our Natural Systems Advisory Group created a charter for ourselves at the very beginning of the process to provide leadership and guidance. And so what our charter statement that we made for ourselves is to provide leadership and guidance related to nature-based solutions and how they play a role in realizing equitable benefits of deep GHG emissions reductions community-wide. So that's kind of been our guiding North Star for this whole process. Next slide. Our AG has about 25 active members made up of a pretty good cross-section of backgrounds and representation. Nick Kincaid with Watershed has been our representative at the steering committee, so you might have seen his face or heard his voice on the phone a few times. Next slide. Our community workshop was held on a rainy Tuesday evening, so despite that, we had about 50 people there, which was great, and we looked at 6 breakout topics, which I apologize that Google has changed the color of the text on there. But they were downtown urban spaces, waterways, gardens and growing food, forests and wilderness, schools, and public parks and trails access were our 6 breakout groups. Next slide. And it's also messed with the function there a little bit. But we really tried to make sure that we kept the conversation not only around GHG emissions and sequestrations for the workshop, but really kept it open to all the multi-benefits of natural systems, as you see here, so health and wellness, quality of life, ecological health, climate change, as well as safety and resilience. Next slide. And the overarching themes that we saw both come out of our workshop as well as what we heard from other AGS workshops, I think both Jen and Phoebe and Nakia mentioned that there were some natural systems related stuff talked about in their workshops as well as some conversation in our AG following these workshops. We spent about 2 meetings just talking about and kind of debriefing what we heard in the workshops. And so the overarching things that came out of all of that is who shoulders the burden, maintenance, which is always a question when you get to natural systems and green spaces, reframing the conversation around aesthetics and what do we value as a community in our green spaces, the cycle of education, stewardship, empowerment, and activism, providing a just transition and how natural systems play a role in economic development, focusing on supporting existing programs and not just adding a bunch of new programs to the mix, but how can we really uplift the programs that are already doing good work in our community, how to use underutilized or mono-use spaces, which is a really interesting conversation. We started talking about cemeteries and things like that. So that was a really interesting point that came up. Nature is really personal in Austin. I think any of us who live here understand that one. And then just how do we make sure that there's community-based decision-making as we go through this process. Next slide. And so what we've talked about as an AG, we've looked at the existing conditions in our natural systems in Austin. We've spent a lot of time looking at related work that our AG members are doing, both in the city and in nonprofits and in the private sector. So we've just talked a lot about what each other is doing. Nature-based solutions for carbon reduction, carbon sequestration potential for specifically wildlands and specifically wildlands in Austin. We've talked some about carbon economics and benefit stacking, as well as we've looked at a whole suite of tools, mostly online calculators and things like that, or mapping systems that could help us with our work, because similar to what Jen was talking about with consumption, is that natural systems and the quantification of sequestration and that kind of thing it's a little bit of new territory right now. It's an emerging industry, and so how we go about quantifying that is going to take some digging into tools that have been developed. Next slide. So as we move forward, we plan to continue to consider, as well as learn more about and dig deeper into the intersection of equity and natural systems, the regulatory framework that we're working within in Texas and what that means for our recommendations, flux and vulnerability of natural systems, both just naturally as well as with climate change, the potential for small scale interventions, and then more larger scale land conservation strategies. Next slide. So this is somewhat an oversimplification of how we see the paths for natural systems, but basically we can sequester more, we can keep the amount of carbon currently sequestered the same, or we can actually deplete carbon sinks and release additional carbon into the atmosphere through our natural systems. So next slide. Not seeing the next slide. Zach.
As the triangle's going down.
Okay, there we go. It just changed. So I think we're all in agreement that we would like to see our natural systems follow the first path, which is additional carbon sequestration via natural systems, which would then allow us as a community to reduce our emissions plus increase sequestration and get to net zero emissions more quickly, and ultimately, hopefully, negative emissions actually by 2050. Next slide. I'm just going to start talking, so I'm not seeing the slide yet, but there we go.
It's on the slide with the TED Talk.
Yeah. So to achieve that, our recommendations, well, we're talking about looking at this idea that came out of a TED Talk by Mark Simmons of the Wildflower Center, which is talking about preserving existing natural systems and carbon sinks, restoring degraded or underperforming natural systems, and then also generating additional opportunities for sequestration and the realization of multi-benefits. So the final slide looks at the likely direction that our recommendations could start taking. I will preface that with our next meeting is on Friday, and we plan to really discuss this and work through this some more. But at this point, we have, what I've seen come out of our conversations is kind of these 4 buckets, and under each we would talk about preserving, restoring, and generating. And so those 4 buckets are natural lands, private property, both small scale, that's where that small scale intervention conversation comes into play, both commercial and residential landscapes, the public urban landscape, so that's parks, urban forests, right-of-ways, things like that, and then working lands, which is looking at our agricultural systems. And then finally, we would probably have a quantification working group as its own thing, just again, because it's a little bit of an unknown right now. And there's a lot of literature and studies being done out there, but at this point, a lot of the quantifications falls into what I would call acceptable estimates of how much sequestration you can expect from a certain type of landscape under certain management conditions. So probably having a whole group just dedicated to looking at that. And that's where we are.
Great, thanks.
Fantastic.
We have about
Thanks.
7 minutes. Any quick questions on this group or the last group? Okay. Well, I think the last few things that we had on the agenda, actually, to step back, I mean, thank you so much for everyone who put together these slides and did these updates. I think it's been really helpful to get to dive in a little bit more into the topics that y'all have been dealing with, and I'm excited about continuing those conversations. Zach, just actually, what is the plan for compiling questions from the chat and maybe responding or having a follow-up conversation?
Yeah. So we can capture what's in the chat, and then we'll just create like a Google Doc from this meeting, and we'll just provide responses to the questions.
Okay, perfect. And then also just to clarify, the slides are already in the Google Doc, and that this call is being recorded. So y'all are going to share this out with anyone who couldn't attend, as well as the advisory groups, and post it publicly, right?
Yep.
Okay, great. And then we just need to check in on process and schedule update, which Zach, that's you, and then do a quick working group check-in and touch base quickly on the agenda for the next meeting. So if we can do that in 5 minutes total, that would be great.
Yeah, so just on the schedule going forward, as you saw, all of the advisory groups are now at the point where they have the less than 5 areas that they're going to focus on for goals and strategies. So what they're all going to be doing now is breaking up into smaller groups, and through the month of April, essentially, like, if your advisory group is 20 people, dividing into groups of 5, 4 subgroups to each work on one of those goal topics. In each advisory group now, we have the equity tool and a template for them to create their goals and strategies. So they're going to break up into these smaller groups, do smaller team meetings, sort of move away from these big meetings with lots of presentations, and then start doing the work of crafting the goals and strategies. So the hope is that by early May, we have the draft of all of that material, and then those draft goals and strategies can be vetted and shared amongst all the groups. We're thinking about doing like a virtual sort of roundtable where we share everything all together. That was going to be a lot easier to do in person, so we're still figuring out how it's going to actually work. But the hope is that by May we have, the draft goals and strategies that this group can start to chew on and figure out how they fit together. And then hopefully through May, we're sort of approving things and agreeing how it all fits together. And then by June, we are moving towards actually writing the document and pulling this all together. On the working group front, the working groups that we had going were the table of contents, which I think for now is kind of we're in an okay place. We have the equity tool, which again, for right now, I think is in a good place. We had goals and quantification. I need the goals and quantification group to be restarted. Kevin and I have been working on quantification, and we need that group to give us some input. So I need the volunteers of that group to work with me to have a meeting next week and go through that. Because that's an important part to all of this, is showing what's needed in all these categories, and then trying to quantify what each group is, delivering in terms of a goal and how that fits in with our overall quantification. So that's important. And then the political working group, I think we agreed that we're just going to put that off for 2 or 3 weeks. And then the next meeting is on the calendar, like in 2 or 3 weeks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just also recognizing that, the political working group action is a little bit complicated, obviously, in the context of what's happening in the world right now. So, yeah. Okay. And who is coordinating the goals and metrics working group?
I will do that.
Okay, cool. All right, Mayuri, so you'll send an email out about that.
Thanks, Mayuri.
Okay. Cool. And then just next steps on the agenda for these meetings. So, we've talked a little bit with co-chairs and with Zach about, do these need to be shorter for the virtual meeting to make sense? you know, is there a way that we need to adapt these meetings in the context of doing this not face to face? So how's everyone feeling about this first version of this digital steering committee meeting?
I think it's perfect for where we are.
I like it. I think 2 hours is good.
I'd like to see if we can connect with folks who didn't get to join to see maybe if they had issues joining or if maybe this is difficult for their schedule.
Carmen
Yeah,
has
that's a
said
great suggestion.
she thinks it works well, and yeah, I think that's something that Zach, let us know if there's something we can do to support. But I do think it would be good to follow up with folks who didn't make this meeting, and if that's something y'all want me to do, I'm happy to do that as well. So let me know.
And just to check in on them too to see if they're doing okay.
Yeah. All right, and then in terms of agenda for the next meeting, anyone have some thoughts? I mean, obviously, I think we're going to have a bit of an iterative process with hearing back from advisory groups as they further develop, you know, the recommendations. But other than that, what other agenda items, Zach and others, should we make sure are on the agenda for next week?
Well, one thing that I know that Zach and Celine and I worked on was putting together some direct examples of the equity tool. I don't know, you know, how much we, obviously they're already available for everybody to see, but if we wanted to have some time to discuss that, you know, that's also important for the advisory groups, I think, to be thinking about. But that's one thing I can think of that we haven't quite done and reviewed in this group.
Yep.
Yeah.
To me, that would make sense to have an equity working group meeting if there's capacity for that, to discuss those examples, provide input. And you know, if it's pretty much done already, that could even be a 30-minute meeting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that could work.
That would be great, and just hearing about how it's going in the advisory groups, and also even maybe next meeting doing a recap, because I know that sustainability staff had a good meeting with the equity staff recently, and so just recapping that would be good. So okay,
yep.
That'll make sense.
One thing, this is Jen, on the equity tool, Zach and I just kind of walked through it a little bit with one of the consumption advisory group members yesterday. And I think it's a lot clearer for us that have been seeing it in various iterations along the way. It's a lot to take in when it's brand new to you for the first time. So we were talking about how it could be helpful to have just kind of a training session on how to use the equity tool for any of the advisory group members to join and learn, especially the folks that are going to be leading the smaller kind of breakout groups on specific topic areas.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I think it'd be helpful to have folks who help design the equity tool co-lead that.
Would we want to have a separate like meeting dedicated just to that, or could we incorporate that into the existing meetings?
Yeah, I mean, we've kind of been showing it off in the advisory group meetings as we've been going. But the idea yesterday was to just like do a special 1 hour viewing on here's how this works, here's how you go through it. We can record it, and then we'll share that out with everybody. We'll go through the examples, and so like it becomes clear in like a dedicated time. People like that idea?
It sounds like a good idea.
Okay.
Yeah, sounds good to me.
If there's anything useful that comes out of the goal setting working group, and we can bring that back to the steering committee, it would be good to at least start to talk about starting positions, the thinking framework that lead into some kind of goal setting or number setting, and that we all agree on those principles that go into that. So we'll see what the working group comes up with, and hopefully there's something we can do with the steering committee.
Yeah, I share that thought.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Well, we're only a few minutes over. So let's call it a day. But I really wanted to say I really appreciate everyone's commitment to doing this format and how many folks showed up for this meeting. So please keep this as a priority. I think we're getting into really important work. And need to take it to the finish line. So I appreciate everyone's effort and time, and also just sharing how everyone's feeling at the beginning. As I think something that we'll continue to try to do in some format. But it's great to see folks' faces. Thanks for all the effort that's going into all this. Any other last comments before we all hop off?
See y'all at happy hour, hopefully.
Oh yeah, virtual clink.
I'll be there.
See ya.
All right, bye y'all.
Thanks so much, everybody. Bye. Get outside.
See you guys. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.